Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a topic that's been making waves across Europe. The idea that the EU is not fully ready for Sweden's rapidly changing political, economic, and security direction. Sweden's transformation over the last few years has turned it into one of the most influential players in Northern Europe, and many believe the EU is struggling to keep up. In this video, we're going to break everything down in a clear and simple way, so make sure to stay with me till the end. Sweden has always been known for its neutral stance, calm diplomacy, and balanced politics. But in recent years, the country has taken a sharp turn towards stronger military alignment, stricter immigration policies, and a more assertive voice inside the European Union. Many European nations were not expecting Sweden to evolve so quickly, and this sudden shift has exposed areas where the EU structure may not be flexible enough to adapt. One major area where the EU appears unprepared is defense cooperation. Sweden's entry into NATO marked a historic pivot in its foreign policy. For decades, Sweden relied on neutrality as its shield, but the current global situation pushed the country to embrace a collective defense approach. Now that Sweden is officially part of a major military alliance, the EU is facing a new kind of member, one that demands stronger security coordination, faster decision-making, and firmer defense commitments. The EU has always struggled to unify its defense strategies, and Sweden's rapid militarization adds even more pressure to a system that's already slow and divided. Another issue is Sweden's tough stance on crime, gang violence, and border control. The Swedish government has introduced policies that are far more aggressive than those promoted by some EU institutions. Many EU officials still prefer a more open, softer approach, but Sweden argues that Europe must rethink security from the inside out. Sweden's rise in gang-related violence shocked Europe, and while the country is taking strong internal action, it is also pushing the EU to tighten external borders and reform migration rules. Some EU members support this, while others strongly oppose it, creating friction that exposes how unprepared the Union is for Sweden's new direction. Economically, Sweden is one of the EU's most advanced and innovative countries. It is a global leader in technology, sustainability, and digital infrastructure. But this creates another challenge. Sweden expects the EU to modernize at a faster pace. While Sweden pushes forward with green technology, renewable energy solutions, and digital reforms, the EU often moves slowly due to bureaucracy and disagreements among member states. Sweden's rapid progress sometimes leaves the EU struggling to catch up, and the gap becomes more noticeable every year. Sweden's strong position in energy independence also clashes with the EU reliance on imported resources. Sweden generates most of its electricity from hydropower, nuclear power, and renewable sources. This makes the country less vulnerable to external energy shocks, while many EU nations still depend heavily on gas imports. When the EU faces energy crises, Sweden does not feel the same level of pressure, and this difference creates policy disagreements. Sweden wants more investment in long-term renewable solutions, while other countries want quick fixes to survive immediate shortages. Culturally and politically, Sweden's internal debate has also influenced the broader European conversation. Sweden was once seen as the model of open immigration and multicultural stability, but as the country faced rising crime, social tensions, and integration challenges, its political landscape shifted dramatically. Parties that were once considered extreme are now part of the mainstream dialogue. This transformation surprised Europe, and some EU leaders are uncomfortable with Sweden's new political tone. The EU struggle to respond to Sweden's domestic shift highlights how unprepared the Union is for rapidly changing social realities across member states. Another important factor is Sweden's strong alignment with the Baltic nations and Nordic partners. Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania share common concerns about security and Russian aggression. This regional alliance has grown so strong that it sometimes moves faster and more decisively than the EU itself. When the Baltic region demands immediate military or economic action, the EU response often lags behind. Sweden's leadership in this region shines a spotlight on the EU's slow decision-making process, making it clear that the Union is not structured to handle fast-moving geopolitical threats. In Brussels, Sweden is becoming more vocal and less patient. Swedish leaders are pushing for reforms in the EU budgeting, border control, environmental policy, and digital regulations. But the EU system was designed for slow negotiation, compromise, and long debates. Sweden's expectations for faster action reveal the weaknesses of a political structure that struggles to adapt to urgent realities. There is also a divide between Sweden's technological advancement and the EU regulatory approach. Sweden supports innovation, entrepreneurship, and rapid digital transformation. Meanwhile, the EU is known for strict regulations that slow down tech growth. Swedish companies like Spotify, IKEA, Volvo, Ericsson, and countless startups want the EU to modernize its rules to stay competitive globally. But many EU countries are not ready to move as quickly as Sweden wants, and this mismatch creates tension. When it comes to climate policy, Sweden is far ahead of most EU nations. Sweden wants Europe to increase its commitment to green energy, electric transportation, and environmental protection. However, some EU members struggle with economic limitations and cannot match Sweden's level of progress. This leads to disagreements on climate targets, funding, and timelines. Sweden pushes for bold action, while others ask for more time and flexibility. This difference exposes how the EU one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work well when member states have such different capabilities. Another reason the EU may not be ready for Sweden is the country's influence on northern trade routes. With the Arctic becoming more accessible, Sweden and other Nordic countries are gaining strategic importance in global shipping. This shift makes Sweden a central player in future trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and North America. The EU has not fully prepared for this transformation, and Sweden's leadership in the Arctic and Baltic regions raises questions about the EU long-term strategy. Sweden's approach to cybersecurity is also ahead of many EU nations. Sweden invests heavily in digital defense, cyber awareness, and information protection. As cyber threats grow across Europe, Sweden expects the EU to develop a stronger unified cyber strategy. However, many EU countries do not have the same level of preparedness, leaving the Union vulnerable. Sweden's advanced position exposes the EU gaps and forces Brussels to rethink its digital defense priorities. Another area where Sweden challenges the EU is transparency and governance. Sweden has one of the world's most open systems of government information. Public access to records, accountability mechanisms, and institutional trust are core values in Swedish society. But not all EU countries follow the same standards. When Sweden demands higher transparency at the EU level, some nations resist because it threatens their internal political practices. This creates friction and highlights the EU difficulty in dealing with countries that expect higher moral and administrative standards. Socially, Sweden's internal debate about integration, crime, and cultural identity has become a symbol of Europe's larger struggle. Many countries in the EU face similar challenges, but Sweden's case is more extreme and visible. Instead of offering a unified solution, the EU often remains divided. Sweden's situation exposes how unprepared the EU is to address the deeper social issues affecting the entire continent. Another major factor is Sweden's shifting political alliances. Over the years, Swedish governments have changed their stance on key EU issues, becoming more strategic and selective in their partnerships. Sweden no longer supports every EU policy automatically. Instead, It carefully chooses what benefits the country the most. This new approach surprises some European leaders who expect Sweden to always side with traditional Western European positions. The EU must now deal with a Sweden that is more independent and assertive. Sweden's relationship with the UK also plays a role. Even after Brexit, Sweden maintains strong economic and security ties with Britain. This gives Sweden an alternative network of alliances outside the EU structure. While Sweden remains committed to the European Union, it also draws strength from partnerships beyond Brussels. The EU was not prepared for member states that can balance internal and external ties so effectively. Another issue is the future of EU expansion. Sweden supports greater integration of the Western Balkans and closer cooperation with Ukraine, but the EU is hesitant, cautious, and slow. Sweden wants the Union to grow strategically and strengthen its borders, while some EU nations worry about economic strain and political instability. This disagreement adds more pressure to an already divided Europe. Sweden's strict approach to foreign policy is another challenge. Sweden has taken firm positions on international human rights, sanctions, and global conflicts. The EU, on the other hand, tends to move slowly and carefully to maintain unity among all members. Sweden's moral and political clarity sometimes clashes with the EU diplomatic balancing act. This exposes a deeper problem. The EU is not built to handle members that demand faster and more principled action. Economically, Sweden's strong currency management, high living standards, and advanced industries create another layer of complexity. Sweden's economy can handle bold reforms more easily than many EU countries. When Sweden pushes for major economic changes, others cannot keep up. This difference slows down the entire EU system and highlights the Union's lack of economic uniformity. Meanwhile, Sweden's transformation from a neutral state to a frontline security nation has reshaped Europe's defense map. Sweden is now a key player in the Baltic Sea, a region that has become one of the world's most sensitive security zones. The EU has not fully adapted to this reality. Sweden expects coordinated defense strategies, joint military planning, and rapid response systems, but the EU is still stuck with slow bureaucratic methods. At the same time, Sweden's strong emphasis on scientific research and technological development has raised expectations. Sweden wants the EU to invest more in innovation, artificial intelligence, green industries, and digital transformation, but many EU countries face economic challenges that slow down their progress. This difference creates tension between Sweden's ambition and the EU limitations. Even Sweden's welfare system creates complexity. Sweden's advanced social model requires consistent economic strength. When the EU pushes for policies that affect national budgets, Sweden must carefully balance its own welfare commitments. This creates disagreements about taxation, funding distribution, and long-term economic planning within the EU. Sweden's influence on European culture is also growing. Swedish music, fashion, design, and technology have a global reach, which gives Sweden a unique cultural power. This cultural leadership shapes European identity in subtle ways. The EU, however, has not fully embraced Sweden's modern, minimalist, and innovative cultural direction. This cultural shift adds another layer of adjustment the EU must make. In addition, Sweden's demographic challenges, an aging population and integration difficulties, mirror the broader European problem. But Sweden's situation is more advanced, which makes it a warning sign for the rest of the EU. Instead of preparing for these future issues, many EU countries remain reactive rather than proactive. The EU unpreparedness also shows in policy negotiations. Sweden is becoming more demanding, more strategic, and less willing to compromise on issues like security, technology, migration, and climate policy. This new Swedish approach puts pressure on a system that was designed for slow consensus, not strong demands from member states. Overall, Sweden's rapid transformation has caught the EU off guard. The country is now stronger militarily, more assertive politically, faster economically, and more critical of EU bureaucracy. Sweden's influence is rising, while the EU struggles to adapt to a member state that expects quicker, smarter, and more decisive action. Sweden wants a more modern Europe, a safer Europe, a smarter Europe. But the EU is still adjusting, still debating, still negotiating. This gap between Sweden's speed and the EU's slowness is the real reason many believe the Union is not ready for Sweden's new role. As Sweden continues to grow in strength and confidence, the EU will eventually have to catch up. The question is not whether Europe will adapt, but how long it will take, and how many challenges will appear along the way. Sweden is shaping the future of European politics, and the EU must learn to move with the same energy, ambition, and clarity. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this script, make sure to stay connected for more detailed explanations and powerful insights.